I was initially hoping to kind of work up to this question, but we got straight into the spiritual stuff, so I might as well jump in. Um, I had this really strange re-encounter with GTD as an adult when I took 5 grams of mushrooms on an empty stomach, psychedelic mushrooms. And towards the end of my trip, I was having this like moment of almost like manic creativity where I noticed that there was all this intentionality just like rising up in my mind and my body, like things that I at my core of my being I knew I wanted to do, but I couldn't do in that moment because it wasn't the right time, or there were 7 other things that I needed to do first, and I also couldn't let go of. So I had to do something about that, and so I started kind of scrawling things all over my whiteboards and like making notes and then texting things to myself and then thinking, you know what, I have a task manager for this, and then started put it in my task manager. And then in that like psychedelic trip, I re-encountered these GTD principles from scratch. And once I realized what it was, I was like, oh, okay, this isn't a productivity technique. This is kind of like a quasi spiritual methodology that's like masquerading as productivity. And so with that, I wanted to ask you this. Like, I think you already alluded to this. I sense that you have this kind of spiritual practice operating in the background, or a spiritual side. And I'd love to hear, like, it's a loaded term, right? But I'd love to hear what spiritual means to you, what that practice is, how you got there. Like, what's your story around that? And if you can tie it into how it led to the GTD method, I think that'd be cool.
Yeah, that's a long story or a short one. I don't know which answer is going to show up here. Uh, to me, spiritual is just with the small s. It's like just things you can't see. I mean, you can't see emotions, you can't see thoughts, unless you're psychic enough that you can see those kinds of things. I'm not. Uh, but spiritual just means the world that you can't see. But the world that you can't materially see is much bigger than the material world you do see. My own personal experience in doing spiritual practices and getting involved with a coach and great friend for 50 years who was ahead of me in terms of his own spiritual involvement and awarenesses. And I wound up sticking around with him and his teachings, a guy named John Roger, for 50 years before he left the planet about 5-6 years ago. And that I got introduced to it because I started having experiences that I would say were spiritual experiences, but I didn't know where they were coming from. Um, I met a guy when I was in graduate school in Berkeley, and by the way, psychedelics, Berkeley '68, right? So uh, I met a guy who he was quite psychic, had been studied at the University of Pennsylvania because of his psychic abilities. And he wound up is the guy who taught me karate. And uh, he chose that because he'd had some out of the body experiences where he saw he would be meeting people that he had a karmic debt to. And he had a lot of his own personal experiences in life that were quite traumatic and quite dramatic. But then, at some point he realized there was a reason that he had all of those, that he was then would have something that he would be able to give people he owed something to. So he met me at a party in the Berkeley Hills. And he said, that's a guy. And so he wound up, he didn't tell me any of this stuff right then. He just said, because he had a black belt in karate. He was a Olympic fencer. He'd been a Formula race driver. He'd run guns for the CIA in Guatemala. He was, this guy was pretty amazing by the time he was in his late teens in terms of the stuff he was doing. So he wound up hanging out with me, and as he did, I began to open up and have all kinds of very powerful spiritual experiences. The only way to describe that, but I didn't know where they were coming from, and I sort of didn't understand it. And having those experiences when I would sort of come back to being conscious and whatever, I had some awarenesses and so forth that I'd never had before, and I saw quite dramatically how people didn't understand any of that, and how unconscious. Most people were, you know, that kind of stuff. So, you know, in a simple, in a strange way, I got really pissed off, sort of railed against the world, and they put me away. So, because I started to act in a kind of aberrated way, and so they threw me in a mental institution. That was quite painful. So at some point, I said, I think I'd rather cooperate with the world than you know, rail against it. So I'm still as crazy as I ever was. You're just looking at a high state of cooperation here, and you know, figured out that okay, let me see what the world wants so that I can sort of get out of this kind of painful situation. So, and then I discovered. I was walking down Telegraph Avenue and walked into Shambhala bookstore just for some intuitive reason. And I looked down and I saw a book called The Gateways to Spiritual Science, Rudolf Steiner. I went, wow, fascinating. And so that started a 6-month trek of then exploring all the occult literature I could read and get a hold of. Madame Blavatsky, Ledbetter, you know, reading about the White Brotherhood, reading about all these things. I mean, oh my God, these people all know kind of what I've been dealing with. And it gave me a context for that. So me and my friend said, well, you know, we need to find, you know, one of those people who seems to be way ahead on this path. We didn't even know there was that path. And then uncovering that there had to be a path, you know, in terms of the spiritual brotherhood, whatever you want to call that. But we didn't have to go to India to do that. So it turned out that one day we were teaching karate, and one of our karate students said, by the way, I just had my aura balanced and had a light study. And we went, oh, really? And she said, yeah, and you guys were on it. So it turns out that this guy had read, you know, previous lifetime, that started to explain the relationship she had with my friend. And, you know, my friend, the you know, quite psychic guy, said, wow, this guy is, wherever this guy's getting his information is coming from a very high level. Let's go, I'd like to meet this guy. And it turned out the guy was giving a seminar in Berkeley that night or the next night. So I went in and walked in and met this guy, John Roger, and he started talking about all this stuff like that and started to make total sense about, you know, the things that I'd been experiencing. So I said, gee, well, I've been hanging out with a lot of different people. Let me hang out with this guy until I find out what he knows. And I'll move and maybe move on. But I'd never found out an end to what JR knew and what he was able to do. So he turned me on to that. And he, you know, he actually created a church simply because people said, look, given what you're doing and the way you're doing that, you better name it as a church. So he said, okay. So, movement of spiritual inner awareness, still around. And, you know, I became a minister in 1972 and been involved in that for a while. So, you know, that's kind of a short version of a very, very long story. That's how I got involved in it. And there was the MSIA, which is the short for the Movement of Spiritual Inner Awareness, MSIA, has a lot of hundreds and hundreds of different kind of techniques, you know, kind of whatever works for you. You know, it's a very universal, you know, kind of spirituality. There's no dogma to it. There's nothing to join. You can't. There's no. You just either, you know, pay attention to what the information and try it out, engage with it. If it works, stick with it. So a lot of it is just meditative kind of practice, but it's more of an active spiritual, exercise, not a passive, you know, think of nothing. It's really chanting and using, you know, mantras that that are designed to really allow you to relax and let go at this level so that you can lift up and then become aware of other levels. So I'm still just a beginning student, given, you know, what there is to learn about all that. There are many mansions in the house.